July 1982. The body of a young woman is discovered near Lake Tahoe in Washoe County, Nevada.
This was an ugly murder that was perpetrated for sexual gratification, most likely.
An investigation is launched, but despite detectives' best efforts, the victim remains unidentified.
We put her dental charts and other identifiable information in the flyer, and we went through Interpol, and we had those flyers distributed to every law enforcement agency in Europe.
Although the case goes cold, it is never closed, with detectives determined to identify both the victim and her killer.
All you had to know is who it was, and whoever was with her on the afternoon of July 17th. That would be the person that should have reported her missing.
In 2018, detectives become aware of a new groundbreaking forensic technology.
There were no leads, there was just nothing else to go on.
Without genetic genealogy, these cases would never have been solved.
This is the gripping story of the Sheep's Flat Jane Doe murder, an exhaustive police investigation, and how it became the first case globally where both the victim and the perpetrator were identified by the Bloodline Detectives.
I think it's important to learn here that it's never too late. These cases can be solved, and with advancements like this, they actually are.
July 17, 1982. Washoe County Sheriff's Office received an emergency call. A body had been discovered near Lake Tahoe.
We got a report that hikers found a body of a young woman. I happened to be in the office at the time, and we dispatched some detectives to the scene.
When we got the call, it was dispatched saying that they'd had a possible homicide up on the Mount Rose Highway in an area called Sheep Flats.
Once they arrived up there, they quickly ascertained that it was a homicide, a murder. And so they secured the scene.
And one thing that you have to be very careful of when you're approaching any crime scene is to not contaminate any evidence.
There was very little evidence of a struggle or protracted fight. She was clothed. Oddly, a pair of men's underwear had been left draped over her remains by, we assume, the assailant.
It appeared that she'd been sitting on a fallen log, possibly either putting on shoes or tying her shoes, but sitting when she was killed, and then she fell forward on her face.
And when we turned her over, it seemed to be a woman probably anywhere between her 20s and mid-30s. You could tell that one of her eyes had been darkened, which shows some sort of blunt force trauma. Her face was a little contorted from being face down, and it was covered with pine needles.
She was just a young woman by herself, dressed in a manner that would have suggested that she had just come from Lake Tahoe. She had a bathing suit on underneath her outer clothing. She was very casually dressed. And sadly, this young woman had absolutely no identification or anything that would lead to an immediate identification of her.
We had called some searchers out from Search and Rescue to come and search the scene and look for evidence as well.
What had occurred there had happened just hours previously.
Well, the crime scene suggested that this had been only an hours-old murder within certainly the last 12 to 18 hours. There was very little degradation of evidence. It was a pristine crime scene in the sense that no other persons, aside from those who had discovered her, had tampered with any of the potential evidence in the crime scene. So from a forensic standpoint, it was very fortunate, and it allowed investigators to recover a great deal of evidence that would have deteriorated very quickly were it not for her quick discovery and the fact that she was undisturbed.
When you walk into a scene like that, you're concerned about footprints because you can either take casts and or close-up photographs and identify a shoe.
There was 2 sets of footprints walking in, but only 1 set walking out.
This young woman had been shot with a handgun in the back of the head at relatively close range and had immediately fallen forward onto the ground.
Being where the body was, it was basically surrounded by pine needles because there's pine trees everywhere. And that causes a specific problem because with pine needles, anything that's laying on top, say a bullet casing or expended round, would fall right into the pine needles and you'd have a hard time finding that. Well, we were looking for basically anything else that might be there, like discarded items, anything that had been there, because it's still, believe it or not, given the heavy traffic, it's still a fairly pristine area.
Once the scene had been processed, the body was moved to the morgue.
While we were in the transition between the crime scene and the autopsy, you start looking for missing people. Because in July, in the summer, Lake Tahoe, where this area is close to, is extremely busy. So we thought that we better find out as quickly as we could everybody that could possibly be missing, anybody that had left their luggage, anybody that checked out of a hotel, left their stuff behind. Those were the kind of things that we knew, because we knew that if you just say, I'm looking for an average lady between 20 and 30 that had been missing, she would probably fit in with about 60% of the people at Lake Tahoe at that day.
While waiting for the information to come in, detectives attended the autopsy.
At the autopsy, when they were able to process the body better, they found that there were 2 gunshot wounds to the head, 1 to the back and 1 behind the right ear.
And she also had, I would say, a 50-cent piece size inoculation on her arm that stood out to Art Newman, who was the deputy coroner at the time. He said it looked like his wife's. She was originally from Germany, and that's what their inoculation looked like. And as a matter of fact, after the autopsy, he drove me straight to his house and showed me his wife's inoculation mark.
The vaccination mark just indicated that she had had, as I recall, a smallpox shot. And yeah, we look at that because not everybody's had those.
She had some unusual and complex dental work, dental restoration work.
So we had a forensic dentist come and chart the teeth, and it was his opinion that this had been done in Europe because he had worked in Europe where he was familiar with that type of work. And that's where it was started to be believed that maybe she was from a foreign country. She had a cesarean scar, which meant that at some point she had had a child.
What's running through your mind is who would have done this. We knew that we were dealing with probably a really bad person, bad guy, probably had an arrest record, someone who had a propensity for violence.
The fact that she is shot at close range in the back of the head suggests an execution. I think it is more likely than not that he was a sexual predator and that this was a premeditated murder, at least from the time that they left the roadway on the Mount Rose Highway and began to walk or hike into the woods.
Most of us believed that she knew the killer and that if we could identify her, we would identify the killer. But that was the difficult thing, before, DNA technology, was how do we identify her?
In In July 1982, Washoe County Sheriff's Office was starting an investigation into the murder of a young woman who'd been discovered in the Sheep's Flat area of Lake Tahoe. She had been shot in the head and had no identification on her body.
It was such a simple case. All you had to know is who it was, and whoever was with her on the afternoon of July 17th, that would be the person that should have reported her missing.
Investigators were checking all available databases to see if there was anyone fitting her description or suspects that could be linked to the crime.
We were at the beginnings of an automated fingerprint search. The database was not as large in 1982 as it is now. A lot of police jurisdictions throughout the country didn't necessarily submit all of their fingerprints to a national database. But her fingerprints were analyzed, sent through the FBI with a request that they try to be matched. That was unsuccessful.
We looked for anything. If we knew what she ate, you know, it might give us a lead, might tell us where we might want to go look. Maybe you could go to a restaurant or at least go check some places and go, hey, look, have you seen this woman? She was last known to, eat, steak or whatever.
Because we'd had some other young women murdered in that time frame, 78, 79, 80, 81, so forth, they did look at possible suspects, but really nobody in particular.
And we also put out a nationwide teletype with her full description, requesting anyone that might have a missing persons case that fit her description to please call us.
In another effort to uncover some leads, detectives had created a poster.
So we had an artist do a rendition, and it depicted her in her natural state because her face really wasn't appropriate to show her picture when we went out and did canvases. It's kind of difficult to go to hotels, casinos, and other locations where her and maybe the suspect had stayed without, some type of photograph to show the employees of said establishment.
Without a name to give anybody, you're talking about all the cities and hospitals through the whole country. To find that information would be pretty hard because you don't have a name, again, to research.
Back in 1982, they had a national missing person, database, and they had pictures from the National Center used to send out periodicals, little magazines back in the day that had pictures of, the missing people and descriptions. They went through all of that. They worked with other agencies. Could this missing girl from our jurisdiction be your Jane Doe? And all of those led to negative results.
From the evidence and the crime scene, detectives were able to build likely scenarios about what had happened and why she remained unidentified.
When I look at the part where she has a bathing suit on under her clothes, so you believe that it was a planned trip to Lake Tahoe. Well, if it was a planned trip with friends, I would think friends would have reported her missing, from that she didn't come back to them, she disappeared from an outing with them at the lake or something. Somebody would have said something, so I actually believe the trip was with him.
There was nothing from the scene that I saw that would indicate that she was necessarily drugged there. So it appeared to me that she walked in with the suspect and that it was the two of them and only one of them left the scene.
And it's a mystery. And you become interested in that and you wonder what type of person the victim was and the suspect and the life they had or didn't have and what occurred, how did they get there? You just have those questions in your own mind as a detective eventually that you like to see answered.
Investigators received the swab analysis from the autopsy.
In this case, we found evidence that would lead us to believe that she was sexually assaulted, which was very good for us because, we had some evidence.
There was semen inside her mouth, and that is indicative of that sexual activity occurring very close in time to her death. Because the mouth produces saliva, materials dissipate very quickly in the mouth and degrade very quickly in the mouth and would be washed away by eating or drinking. So you could assume that that evidence was left in very close proximity to her murder because it was still present.
With no positive result from all of their local and national searches, detectives decided to direct the investigation elsewhere.
We actually did a flyer with her picture, description, approximate date of birth, and her, date of death and what have you. And we put her dental charts and other identifiable information in the flyer. And we went through Interpol, and we had those flyers distributed to every law enforcement agency in Europe. We got some inquiries, and in fact, I recall when I was in there as a supervisor, a really good match, someone that went to the United States from Europe. They disappeared, and very close likeness, both in age, physical description, but that turned out not to be her.
They followed up on anybody that called in and had possible information, thought that, could it be this person, could it be this person? They did all of those follow-ups, but all the follow-ups led to her remaining a Jane Doe.
And she was buried as an unidentified body.
She was buried in our Mother of Sorrows in Reno, Nevada. She was buried as a Jane Doe.
We still preserve the evidence, of the sexual assault. That evidence is preserved in the crime lab indefinitely.
In the early 2000s, with forensics advancing rapidly, detectives did another review of the case.
It never really went cold. At some point, DNA gets online. I went to the crime lab in '93, and we put it into whatever system we could. When CODIS came online, we put it into the system. When DNA got more sophisticated, we put it into the system. Every time that the FBI fingerprint system came on board, which connected just about everybody, we ran the prints again. So as technology developed, this case has a perfect chronology of the progression of forensic science.
But it was in the early part of the 21st century that this science began to transform crime solving, something the investigators had been hoping for.
I was assigned right at the end of 2000 to handle cold cases, to look for, in my mind, was just to go through each case looking for something that could possibly have DNA. Early in 2001, I submitted several items from the evidence to the crime lab to check for DNA. They had already submitted it through every place in the country and come up with nothing. So the person wasn't in the system at that time. Since there was no DNA matches here in the US, I contacted Interpol because of the investigation, where detectives believed that it could be European dental work and with the vaccine mark. Well, eventually they actually came up with a match of a man that was in Switzerland. And what we wanted to do at that point was to send a detective to Switzerland and try and get another DNA sample, because European DNA at that time had less parameters than we do in the US. So we would naturally, for us, have to get another DNA sample to run it through our database again to see if it was a perfect match. Eventually it wasn't.
Detectives kept trying.
We tried to go back through other homicides in northern Nevada to see if there was potentially any link between other convicted homicide suspects, other convicted sexual assault suspects. many of the persons who had been arrested in that era, in the late 70s through the middle 80s, that all predated the DNA database. So in a lot of instances, we had convicted murder suspects that had been on the streets at the time this young woman was murdered, who had subsequently been arrested and convicted for violent crimes, but were not in the DNA database. And so we made an effort to eliminate those individuals from consideration as well when they had similar MOs.
This was what we would call literally a smoking gun case. I was in the middle of a really difficult case. I thought that this case would be solved as soon as we knew who she was. And the fact that nobody reported her missing even makes it worse, because I have always tried to think it was important to stand for the people that don't have anybody to take care of them.
Despite investigators' best efforts, the victim remained unknown.
Somebody somewhere, if they cared about this person, would have made a missing persons report. And the only people that don't are maybe one, she doesn't have family left. The killer knows that, and of course, he's not going to say she's missing, say a husband or boyfriend or something like that. Maybe she traveled, from, place to place to stay, sleep, whatever. So she wasn't always in the same area for a certain time frame to where she had friends that would have said, hey, what happened to her?
So despite their best efforts, detectives continue to hit a wall. And at a remove of over a quarter of a century, they were still frustrated. In July 1982, Washoe County Sheriff's Office were in the middle of an investigation into the murder of a young woman. She had been discovered in the Sheep's Flat area of Lake Tahoe. She had been shot in the head, and they could not identify her. But investigators were beginning to look at new ways to approach crime solving.
Back in 2018, the Washoe County Forensic Science Division, we had discussed, is there a way to use genealogy for law enforcement to access any of these databases and sites?
One of our forensic DNA experts went to a seminar, and it was put on by DNA experts from across the country, not necessarily in law enforcement, but in the private sector.
The seminar led the detectives to a project which kick-started a hunt for Jane Doe.
So we were contacted in early 2018 by the Washoe County Sheriff's Office because they had an unidentified Jane Doe, to see if there was some way that we could help them with their case.
The project explained their procedure to the detectives.
We use genetic genealogy, forensic genealogy, but more advanced. This was more sort of like ancestry testing, where you test everything, all the DNA, and then you come up with a list of DNA cousins. And then based on how you related to all those cousins, you try to figure out who you are.
The investigating team knew they were accessing a much greater pool of possibilities.
Even though law enforcement has what we consider a relatively significant number of people in our database, that number pales in comparison to the size of the private databases that genealogists are working with right now. And that's very exciting because of the potential then to make a link to a relative of an unidentified victim, or to make a link to a relative of a potential suspect.
In the Washoe case, the police needed to identify the killer and the victim.
Our first step was to get the agency to ship the bloody fabric to the lab that we use. They then did the whole genome sequencing, which took probably 6 to 8 weeks. After that, they generate a very large data file. Once you upload that file, it takes about 24 hours for it to be compared with all the other million people who are in that database to see if any of those other people share DNA with you, or in our case, with our victim, with our doe.
The first run of the genome profile yielded a match.
Discovering her identity was unbelievable because at first, the first match that came up, it was like second cousin, which is okay. You know, it's not as close as we'd like.
They got in touch with the second cousin. She had recently searched for her family through the Ancestry websites and had found a woman who was also a second cousin. So they went to talk with the newest second cousin.
She then ended up sharing twice as much DNA, and so became our top match. One of her parents was a sibling of our doe. So this became our air folks, and this was very shortly, within the first 48 hours, I would say, of this case.
This second cousin was a more direct relation of the Washoe Jane Doe. But there was a complication.
This woman, who was now the top match, was herself adopted. So she did not know the names of her parents.
Now, this is quite common with these databases because lots of people who are adopted take those tests because they're adopted. And you have to solve their adoption case before you figure out your Jane or John Doe.
Although the adoption records were closed where this woman was adopted, she had been provided, as adoptees often are, with a report of what they called non-identifying information. So clues about her mother's age and her ancestry, her occupation, where she grew up, what her siblings were, a little bit about her parents, just enough that we were able to piece together where in that family tree that we were building was her likely mother.
With this new information, they discovered that the grandfather had married twice, and that the murder victim was from the second marriage. And with more digging, they were able to find the victim's parents, who were from the Detroit area.
That's when DNA Doe Project started working with me, and they were able to identify the parents of Jane Doe. Their names were John and Blanche Silvani.
When the neighbors were asked to provide information, they duly obliged.
The next door neighbors, given that that family had been many years at the same address, the next door neighbors ought to know who the kids were in that family. They might even know what schools they went to. They would be a great source of information and confirmation in this case. That ultimately became the breakthrough.
After a gap of over 35 years, Genealogy was finally able to identify the woman whose murdered body had been found in Nevada in July 1982.
The daughter's name was Mary Silvani, and it was at that moment that we had a firm candidate that we could give to the agency.
The identification had come from a complex family tree.
John and Blanche Silvani had 3 biological children together: Robert Silvani, Charles Silvani, and Mary Silvani.
But what was provided was not regarded as conclusive.
We had provided additional evidence. We had located a living son of one of her brothers. We sent him a direct-to-consumer test, and his results came back confirming that he was a full nephew. So we were setting new forensic evidence standards with cases like these, trying to show coroners that even absent your usual traditional means of confirmation, when you have this sort of genetic genealogy evidence, then the probabilities are extremely low that it would not be your candidate. The coroner still wanted more, and there were no other traditional methods to make that confirmation. So months went by, and again, Detective Bishop came to the rescue.
I reached out to a cold case unit of the Detroit Police Department, and one of the detectives there reached out to somebody that's good at finding old records.
In the archives, they found an old file involving Mary Silvani.
That allowed investigators to obtain her physical fingerprints from a very simple misdemeanor arrest for, I believe it was for trespassing when she was a very young woman.
And our fingerprint expert analyzed our Jane Doe's fingerprints to Mary Silvani's fingerprints and positively said that these were one and the same subject. And so she was positively identified as Mary Silvani at that time.
For all concerned, identifying Mary Silvani was an emotional experience.
We were all so thrilled and excited and proud and satisfied that we could return her name to her.
This has been a weight I've carried since 1982. And again, it was extremely frustrating because all we had to know was who she was.
She was born into a family of immigrants. Her father, John, was from Italy, and her mother, Blanche, was from Canada.
After Mary's mother died in hospital, she was left to be raised by her father and 2 brothers.
Her father also died when she was 16 or 17, so already there was lack of a support system for her.
So Mary remained in the house with her brothers until after she graduated high school. And then at that point, there was really nothing holding them back or tying them down to that area. So she and her brothers ended up moving out to California, but then they went their separate ways and lost touch with one another.
Mary had lived a carefree and somewhat unstructured life.
Mary waited tables. She kind of floated around from job to job and never really found her sole passion in life. When she lived in the Plymouth area, met a great friend, Nancy Cummings, and they were just kindred spirits. They worked together, and they did what a lot of high school-aged children would do. They enjoyed life. They went dancing, they had fun, they enjoyed the arts. In fact, Mary was really close to Nancy's family. They even went on vacations together. Mary was someone who liked to explore and travel, and so her friends actually were not concerned about her and had no reason to really report it. It honestly was just an example of the times. And so essentially, Mary just fell through the cracks.
The Silvani family had, in a sense, fallen apart.
She didn't seem to have the support of her immediate family even to help her navigate through her life.
Robert Silvani was about 8 years older than Mary. He, at one time, for a short period of time, worked for one of the local fire departments there. He was married to a woman, had a son, and then decided that he was going to move to LA and try and become a movie star, and left his family.
One of her brothers was a part of an armed robbery, and he went to prison for a while. I don't know if he went for that robbery or a different one, but he was in prison for a while.
Moved to California, got into some more trouble.
And her brother was a murder suspect who was being chased by the police, and he ended up jumping off a building while he was being chased and died.
More came forward when they released the information to the media.
After it was released to the press, one of her friends came forward and gave some information to the Detroit press that she had been a bridesmaid for her wedding. That shed a little more light on her life.
In 2019, police in Washoe County, Nevada had finally found who the Jane Doe they'd found murdered in 1982 was. Mary Silvani had been identified using DNA technology, but police still needed to find out who had killed her.
We took the DNA from the crime scene that was found from the sexual assault kit from our victim. We had what we believed was the suspect DNA, and so the genealogy ancestral search began.
Chasing the perpetrator, catching her killer was also like a big adventure in genealogy land. And we came up with a second cousin. Her name was Norma.
They found Norma's great-grandfather so they could follow the male line of the family. Thomas had 3 sons, and one of his sons had a male heir.
Grandpa only had one grandson, and that had to be our killer, right? Okay, so we have to get his DNA, we have to do some kind of matching, some kind of analysis. We had a law enforcement officer sit outside of his house and monitor, hoping he would come out and drink a Coke and throw it in the trash, or, something would happen so that, we could get his DNA. Nothing happened. Nothing happened.
Nothing had happened for a very good reason.
After a while, we realized he had just died. He died like a few weeks earlier. We missed him.
But the genealogy trail continued.
He himself has a son who has a criminal record, and he's in prison. In other words, he's in CODIS. This was in Texas. The state of Texas allows familial matching. So we got the DNA from this son of our candidate and matched it against the crime scene DNA. And if this is the end of the story, we should be able to say that the guy that left the DNA at the scene of the crime is probably the father of our guy in CODIS. And there was no match.
This could only mean one of 2 things.
Either that guy in prison was illegitimate, or this isn't our killer.
There was another possibility.
There's another grandson we don't know about somewhere out there in the world. Maybe Dad had a fling and had another son. So the genealogist just worked and worked and worked, and finally she was able to connect that side to a woman named Anna who lived around the corner from Dad when they were teenagers. And Anna had had a son with him, and she got married, subsequently married, to a man named Curry, and they moved to California with the son. So she had only one son, and he died, so we don't have his DNA either.
But all was not lost.
But he has a son in prison in California. So California, we got the DNA from that son in prison, we compared it to the crime scene data, and there was a match. So the guy in prison had to be the son of the guy who committed the crime, and we knew that that was Anna's son, James Curry.
James Curry was born in Texas in 1946. We do know that he had a series of issues with getting in trouble with the law.
Curry had a significant criminal past.
I believe it was a 20-year sentence, and in 1977, he was released after 7 years, and at that time he moved to a small town in California where his mother was residing.
His background was indicative of who we thought he probably would have been. Somebody who had been in jail a lot, a violent offender, not the best of citizens, and I'm putting it mildly.
From what I have learned, James Curry was a suspect in 3 different murders in Northern California.
In 1983, Curry was arrested. Shortly after being arrested, he actually admitted to murdering 2 people, a husband and wife who owned some storage units.
During that interview, he tells police that when they search his storage unit, that they're going to find another body. And so they went and did the search of his unit, and as he stated, there was another victim that had been there almost a year's time, I believe. And so they know that he killed those 3 for sure.
But Curry was now beyond the reach of law enforcement.
He was then placed into physical custody in a jail where he hung himself. As a result of that, he was never able to be brought to trial.
In reading his history, it seemed that crime was his way of life, and that he didn't hold a lot of remorse for even the killing of an innocent victim.
When Curry admitted to these murders, it was only 5 months after Mary Silvani's murder.
So what had happened between Mary Silvani and Curry? Did they know one another?
I think there's a good chance that they had recently become acquainted. I don't know if that was hours or days or weeks, but based on his timeline, I know that the association couldn't have been a years-long association. Every murder's ugly, and this was an ugly murder that was perpetrated for sexual gratification, most likely, and those are ugly circumstances.
I thought he was probably somebody that could be devoid of any remorse and that could basically have a summer day and kind of enjoy himself and then just walk behind somebody and shoot him in the head. That puts it pretty much in the horrific category.
But police have no doubts about the immediacy of the killing.
Certainly the murder was instantaneous, and fortunately, I guess for her, the wounds that she suffered were so devastating that death would have been instantaneous, and I guess that's a positive. I would have hate to have thought that she would have languished for any period of time before she died, and I have no reason to believe that she did.
The inscription on Mary's grave could now be completed.
It's a real person who lived and died and had a name that we were able to bring back to that person. The inscription on the headstone and the design of the headstone was from her nephew, the living son of her brother that we had reached out to. He was in contact with the cemetery and with the other close matches who he now knew were members of his own family. And together they designed the headstone, and the cemetery very graciously paid for it.
The death certificate in Washoe County read Jane Doe. Once she was positively identified, it was changed to her true biological name of Mary Silvani.
Police have no doubts as to the tragic consequences visited upon Mary's life.
A young, attractive young lady who had, a future ahead of her, whose life was snuffed out by an individual that had obviously no regard for human life or human sanctity or any of the things that 99.9% of Americans and us as a human race hold dear.
The identification of Mary and her killer is now regarded as a landmark investigation.
This is the first case globally where both the suspect and the victim were able to be identified using genetic genealogy. I think it's important to learn here that it's never too late. These cases can be solved, and with advancements like this, they actually are.
In this case, as with all of our cases, I would say, without genetic genealogy, the case would still be cold. There were no leads. There was just nothing else to go on in a case like this that could have ever brought the authorities to the family where she grew up.
I am excited that local law enforcement is embracing these advances in technology. Hopefully, our community will continue to benefit from those advances.
I hate that we still can have John Does and Jane Does out there. And so by people voluntarily uploading their DNA into these databases, allowing us access, that's how this case was solved. And I thank the community and everybody out there for that.
Because of DNA technology, we're not going to have very many unsolved cases at Washoe County because we are on a roll, if you will. Not only us, but other jurisdictions across the nation, because you can identify these murderers, these rapists, and DNA is the best evidence in the world. I mean, you can't dispute DNA evidence.
I'm glad I lived to see it, because this was definitely on my bucket list. I was a 31-year-old detective when this happened. I'm 68 years old now. It's been a long pull, but I can scratch this off my list. It's not that I think justice was done. but I think it's over.
You know, it is exciting, and it's exciting to be one of the pioneers. What you bring to them is release. You bring to them information and release. Now they have the answer. They can use that energy to go forward, to resolve it, to come to terms with what happened, to understand it. So, you know, they can go forward in life and let it go.
It's incredible to think of the power of familial DNA for a case to go unsolved so long, and then for these advancements to be made where closure can actually be brought to cases.
And for law enforcement, forensics technology of this sort is a major boon, not a threat.
So there's a lot of resources that are brought to bear on these cases, and they should be used for a last resort. So we're not putting detectives out of business in any sense of the word, but ultimately they are finding that when all else fails, genetic genealogy will often be the way to finding a solution.